Well, good morning, friends. My name is Cameron Nations. I am the canon for vocations for the diocese, and I am so glad to be with you this morning as a good many of your number are up at camp for the parish retreat, and that ties in with what I'll talk about this morning. I'll come back to that in a minute, but in my role as canon for vocations, I have a hand in all things leadership development across the diocese, raising up leaders, both lay and ordained, for the work of mission and ministry across the church, and helping to aid and guide in people's discernment as they seek to follow God's call in their life. Essentially, we have a word in the church for leadership development. It's called discipleship, okay? And that's basically what I have a hand in. And so today I want to talk about something that is absolutely necessary for a life of discipleship, for doing the work that God gives us to do, and that is rest. Rest. We have to rest in order to be able to do God's work in the world. But God's vision for rest runs counter to some of the most prevalent visions of rest that we have in our culture. And so I want to talk about that today, given that, again, some of us hopefully have been resting up at camp and will come back renewed for the work of ministry. And so I want to make sure when they get back, they note that there was some restoration going on here too, okay, while they were at camp. So as an English major who married an English major who's getting her PhD in English, it is probably no surprise to anyone that I like words, okay? I love words. Words are a big thing in our household. And so one of the things that I actually look forward to every year is the word of the year, you know, that like Oxford University Press or Merriam-Webster's, they both publish a word of the year. I think dictionary.com kind of does one too because they don't want to be left out. They want to be seen as a legitimate dictionary. But I look forward to these every year, and they all have different criteria for choosing what the word of the year is going to be. But I always look forward to seeing what is it that we humans seem to be saying a lot or using a lot, or what word seems to be most salient to our common life in a given year. And Oxford's word of the year for 2024, I thought was rather interesting and relevant to today's text. Does anybody know what it is? Are there any like nerds out there who just committed this to memory? Okay. It is brain rot. That was Oxford's word of the year in 2024, brain rot, okay? Which it defines as, quote, the supposed, and I think it's very generous in saying supposed. I think we're getting data on this that's not so supposed. But anyway, the supposed deterioration of a person's mental or intellectual state, especially viewed as a result of the overconsumption of material, particularly online content, considered to be trivial or unchallenging. Also, something characterized as likely to lead to such deterioration, right? It's a colloquialism, brain rot. We're all suffering from it. Now, what I thought was so fascinating, though, is that even though the usage of this term has exploded in the last couple of years, the origins of the word are actually not new. They date from the origin dates from the mid-1800s, involves a book you probably were forced to read in high school or college, and also the Great Potato Famine, okay? The first person to use the word brain rot was actually Henry David Thoreau in his book Walden. And Thoreau uses the term to describe what he saw as society's devaluing of complex ideas in favor of simple ones that required less intellectual effort. He writes, quote, "While England endeavors to cure the potato rot," okay, so he's talking about what's going on over there in the famine, okay, "While England endeavors to cure the potato rot, will not anyone endeavor to cure the brain rot which prevails so much more widely and fatally?" Okay, now I think if you're an Irish person who is fleeing to come to America because there's no food, you might take issue with Thoreau talking about that this is much more fatal, the brain rot. But nevertheless, I can only imagine what he would have thought about ChatGPT. You know what I'm saying? Thoreau would not know what to do out there in the cabin talking to his phone, probably. He'd be typing messages and having conversations. Anyway, But brain rot is not just about taking the easy way out intellectually. It's also become one of the ways that we think of leisure activity, that we think about rest. In fact, it's become one of the ways that we define rest, is by doing things that basically waste us away, right? The absence of activity. Brain rot is akin to another colloquialism y'all might be familiar with, bed rotting. Have y'all heard about this? Okay, it sounds gross, first of all. We need to admit. But what it means is it refers to a practice of lounging in bed for extended periods of time, often with snacks, because you have to have sustenance on the journey, I guess. Often with snacks, while scrolling on your phone mindlessly or watching hours of TV or videos online, and with the stated intention of avoiding social contact. Okay, that's what it means to rot in your bed, I guess. Okay. Now I will just say, let ye who is without sin cast the first stone. I think we've all been guilty of spending a day, especially a day of bad weather, sitting inside watching movies all day, right? We've all done our fair share of rotting. And sometimes that's actually perfectly fine. But all of this gets at a really important question for us as both just people, but also as Christians more specifically, which is, what is rest, what is it for, and why is it important for us as disciples and followers of Jesus? So I want to argue today that God's vision of rest is richer and more life-giving than the most prevalent forms of rest that we find on offer in our culture, and that God intends rest to restore us. If you don't remember anything else I say, please don't remember bed rotting and brain rot, but remember, rest is restoration. Restoration, that's what it's all supposed to be about. God intends rest to restore us so that we can be in right relationship both with Him and with one another. And God intends it to liberate us from the things and practices that hold us down, and to develop and impart the spiritual resilience that we need to face the most challenging aspects of our lives, because life is hard. And God intends rest to help us get through it together. So as you can see, this is a discipleship issue. Now, there are two views of rest that I think are most prevalent in our culture. I've already kind of talked about one, which is rest as rot, as like wasting away or doing something that is the antithesis of activity. Like, what is the most mindless thing you can do? And that is one way that our culture defines rest. Now, I know I've already talked a bit about this, but it does bear saying that while getting enough sleep or having a lazy morning or afternoon every now and again is perfectly fine, I mean, this is what the day after Thanksgiving is for, right? This is it. That is for wasting away. But all of that's fine. There are studies done on these kinds of practices, and they are linked with negative impacts to sleep, right? Ironically, by spending more time in your bed just sitting scrolling on your phone, you actually sleep less well. And there are negative impacts to other things, like you have lower energy levels overall, higher anxiety, and greater incidences of social isolation. We become disconnected from one another. Now, as I mentioned, God intends rest for restoration, liberation, and spiritual sustenance. And this idea of wasting away doesn't really sound very liberating, does it? That's because it isn't. It's actually one of the ways that we can become more fully ensnared and trapped in self-referential spirals of melancholy, and it worsens symptoms of conditions like depression. You see, because God's vision of rest is not the absence of things, the absence of people or activity. God's vision for rest actually helps us draw closer to one another. It's about connection and community. Now, for those introverts in the room, it is important to take time away from other people, okay? But, nevertheless, connection and community are crucial aspects of rest. So that's one approach to rest that we find in our culture. But the other is almost the polar opposite of this, and this is rest as optimization. Are y'all familiar with this kind of rest? Some of you may practice it. We tend to be very active practitioners of rest as optimization. This is the kind of rest where our rest becomes gamified, where you can win or lose at how well you rest. It's a way of making us more productive, where rest is all about your productivity. This is the kind of rest and self-care that is often peddled by influencers on social media. These are people who are very clean, they look really good, and they always wear athleisure, okay? Are y'all familiar? This is the kind of rest where you have those videos and every minute of their morning routine is, done out to the minute, where you're dipping your face in the ice bath and you're doing, I don't even know why you do that. But anyway, and this is that kind of rest, right? Rest as optimization. And it doesn't take long before this kind of rest begins to make you feel like you are not measuring up, right? You are not good enough. You're not enough. You're not good enough at resting. We aren't doing it right. We aren't utilizing the right products or the right practices or whatever, and it becomes a way of keeping score. And this way of viewing rest also traps us and ensnares us. To be our best, to look our best, to achieve our best, it all is so exhausting. And at the end of the day, what makes this vision of rest antithetical to God's vision and that it is totally without grace. It's lacking any sense of grace. It becomes a kind of works righteousness to rest like this. And so both of these forms that I've just outlined of so-called rest, they don't actually lead to restoration or liberation at all. In fact, the irony is they often make us more tired. So neither are ultimately life-giving. And so what is God's vision for rest? What is God's vision for rest? Well, we see some bits of this vision exposed for us in our gospel reading and in our reading from Isaiah. Now, Jesus, of course, is all about being life-giving. It's all about giving life and giving life to the full. And we hear today in our gospel reading from Luke about a woman who knew what it was like, who was well acquainted with what it is like to be held down by life circumstances. It says that for 18 years she suffered from a demon. It's been so debilitating, whatever that demon is, whatever that means for her, that she can't even stand up straight. And so at the end of her rope, she comes to Jesus while in the synagogue, while at church, right? It's the place you're supposed to come when you need rest and restoration. The only problem, though, with this is that though she finds healing, it happens to be on the wrong day, doesn't it? It's the Sabbath. And we may remember that the Sabbath day and keeping the Sabbath holy is one of the 10 Commandments, right? It's one of the big ones. It's one of the big rules. Now, in the Old Testament, the Sabbath has two primary associations. One we get from Genesis and one we get from Deuteronomy. The first association is as a day of rest, right? God created the heavens and the earth. He creates the universe. He does that during the week. And then on the last day, what does God do? Oh, man, he rests. Yeah. We don't sound very enthusiastic about it today, but God rests, yes. Then in Deuteronomy, we get another reading of what it means to rest on the Sabbath, which is there's this association made with the Sabbath and with God's liberation of his people from the yoke of slavery in Egypt, right? So there's rest for worship, and then there is rest that is associated with liberation from oppression. And so the Pharisees object to Jesus on the grounds that healing apparently constitutes work that you're not supposed to do on the Sabbath and therefore violates the mandate to rest. But Jesus points out that they still take care of their animals on the Sabbath. They still lead them to water. And so why wouldn't he also heal someone on the Sabbath? Not to mention, right, this demon had been oppressing this woman for so long, almost 2 decades. And is not the Sabbath also for liberation, Jesus seems to be saying? I mean, there is no better day, actually, to be healed than the Sabbath. The Pharisees' reactions to this aren't just hypocritical, but they also tell us that much like you and me, they've lost the plot about the Sabbath and what the Sabbath was for. They'd forgotten God's vision for rest as restoration. Rest not merely as the absence of activity, but as the presence of God's restorative and life-giving Spirit. Then there's this vision we have in Isaiah. Now, I want to say there is so much going on here within this Isaiah passage. We cannot get to it. There's so much going on behind this passage from Isaiah. Anyway, it's amazing, and it has a lot to do with Israel's liberation out of captivity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what I want to point to this morning is at the very beginning of the passage that we read, we hear about this yoke, And earlier in this same portion of Isaiah, the prophet refers to this yoke specifically as the yoke of oppression. And so we hear this theme of liberation again. The yoke of oppression. And then we get this morning this immensely beautiful vision of what happens when we not only keep the Sabbath well and find our rest in God, but also when we keep God and the service of others our focus. That again, rest is meant to restore us to right relationship with God and with one another. Now, it won't surprise you, therefore, that if you read this passage a certain way, it's very clear that God considers church as a form of rest. So good job for being here this morning and for doing that work. So when we find our rest in God, we find what we need in the desert places, Isaiah reminds us, in the wilderness places, the desolate places, the challenging places. Isaiah says that we find guidance and hope when we find our rest in God. It's also that when we find our rest in God, the world is better for it. Isaiah says that you shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of the streets to live in. This idea that when God's people are resting in Him, the world is actually enriched. It's like a garden, he says, a watered garden where these beautiful plants spring up. The needs of others are met. In short, when we rest in God, we find our restoration, our liberation, and the resilience and spiritual sustenance we need for our journey. So in conclusion, rest is important. It's vital for a life of discipleship. Self-care is important. And sometimes watching all of the extended editions of Lord of the Rings back to back is important, okay? Sometimes that's doing the Lord's work. But today's texts remind us that in the face of our own understandings of what rest and the Sabbath are supposed to be, God's vision for rest has our flourishing and the flourishing of the whole world in mind. So friends, if you are feeling exhausted this morning, if you are feeling worn down, beat down, burnt out, unable to stand up straight, if you are feeling isolated and alone, if you're deep in the midst of a hard and challenging place in your life where you don't know where to turn to or which way to go, if you have lost your sense of purpose and meaning, your will to keep going, if the yoke that rests on your shoulders feels like it's got you bent over, and it feels like that yoke of oppression, I'll introduce you to someone that I know who said once, "Come to me, all those who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy," Jesus says, "and my burden is light."